It started with an extension cord. A long, orange snake stretching from my house to my neighbor's yard, plugged into my outdoor outlet like it belonged there. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things. Maybe I had left something out by mistake. But then I followed the cord. And that's when I found out Karen, the self-appointed HOA dictator of the neighborhood, was stealing my electricity. The same woman who once fined a neighbor for having an unauthorized garden gnome was now trespassing onto my property, helping herself to my power, and acting like I was the unreasonable one. I could have let it slide. I could have ignored it. But Karen had a habit of pushing people too far. And this time, she picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. It was a quiet, ordinary neighborhood. The kind where everyone knew each other just enough to exchange nods while taking out the trash, but not enough to borrow sugar without it feeling weird. A place where the biggest drama was whether or not someone's Halloween decorations stayed up too long. That is, until Karen. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. No, she was the self-appointed guardian of all things correct, the self-proclaimed HOA enforcer, despite holding no official title. She carried a clipboard like it was a weapon and walked the cul-de-sac with the confidence of a queen surveying her kingdom. Rules weren't just guidelines to her. They were sacred texts, and she made it her personal mission to ensure that every mailbox, every lawn, and every porch light met her impossible standards. At first, it was small things. A strongly worded note about unauthorized holiday decorations slipped into a mailbox. A passive-aggressive comment about a lawn being half an inch too long. One time, she actually measured a neighbor's fence and declared it dangerously close to violating HOA regulations. She kept a mental catalog of every so-called infraction and doled out violation notices like Halloween candy, except no one wanted them. I had my first run-in with Karen over something equally ridiculous, my trash cans. Apparently, I had committed the ultimate neighborhood sin of leaving them out a few minutes past the approved collection window. She stood at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, shaking her head like I'd just committed a crime against humanity. "You really need to be more mindful of HOA regulations," she scolded, as if I were a child who forgot to do his homework. I shrugged it off. After all, it was just a trash can. But Karen? She wasn't the type to let things go. Little did I know, the real battle hadn't even started yet. The petty complaints were just her warm-up. Because soon, Karen would take her entitlement to a whole new level by helping herself to my electricity. And that was the moment everything changed. One evening, as I was watering my plants, something caught my eye. A long, orange extension cord snaked across my yard, stretching from the side of my house all the way into Karen's backyard. At first, I thought maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it was an old cord I had forgotten about. But as I followed it, my confusion turned to disbelief. The cord was plugged directly into my outdoor outlet, disappearing behind Karen's fence like a thief slipping away into the night. I stood there for a moment, just processing. Was this real? Did my neighbor, the Karen, the same woman who once scolded me for not aligning my garbage bins perfectly with the curb, actually have the audacity to steal my electricity? Oh, but it wasn't just audacity. It was full-blown, industrial-strength entitlement. I marched straight to her door and knocked. No, knocked is too polite, I pounded. A few seconds later, Karen appeared, clipboard in hand, looking mildly annoyed, as if I was inconveniencing her. "Hey, Karen," I said, forcing a smile. I couldn't help but notice this extension cord plugged into my house. Any idea why it's there? She barely blinked. "Oh, that? It's for my greenhouse." I waited for her to elaborate, to offer some kind of apology, or, at the very least, a sign that she understood this was wildly inappropriate. Instead, she just stood there, arms crossed, looking at me like I was the unreasonable one. "You're using my electricity?" I asked, just to be absolutely sure I wasn't misinterpreting. "Well," she sighed, exasperated, "it's just a little bit, and it's for a good cause. I'm growing organic vegetables. Sustainable living. You should really be supporting this." I blinked. "Karen, you're stealing." She gasped as if I had accused her of robbing a bank. "It's not stealing. It's sharing." "No, it's stealing," I repeated, pointing at the cord. "That's my electricity. You're using it without asking." Her lips tightened. "Look, it's barely anything. It's just powering a few heat lamps. And besides, I pay HOA dues just like you do. We're all part of the same community." She waved a hand dismissively. "Honestly, I thought you'd be more neighborly about this." Neighborly. Neighborly. The same woman who once left a typed complaint about my porch light being too bright for the aesthetic harmony of the street was now lecturing me about being neighborly. I took a deep breath, pinching the bridge of my nose. "Karen, you need to unplug that cord. Right now." She scoffed. "Oh, come on. It's winter. The plants need heat. If you were a real environmentalist, you wouldn't make such a big deal out of something so small." I had heard of entitlement before, but this was Olympic-level entitlement. "Unplug it," I repeated, "or I'll do it for you." She huffed, muttering something about selfish neighbors as she stormed off toward her backyard. A few seconds later, the cord slackened, and I heard the click of a plug being yanked from an outlet. I walked back to my house, shaking my head. I thought that was the end of it. I was so wrong. The next morning, I walked outside, half expecting to find Karen standing in my yard with a PowerPoint presentation on why I should reconsider my stance on communal electricity. Thankfully, she wasn't there. But as I glanced toward my side yard, something was off. The extension cord was back. I followed the orange snake with growing frustration, and sure enough, there it was, plugged right into my outlet, just like before. As if our conversation never even happened. I didn't even hesitate this time. I stormed over, yanked the cord out of the socket, and carried the whole thing back to her front door like an Amazon package she didn't order. I knocked hard. When Karen answered, her face twisted into an expression of exaggerated offense, as if I had wronged her. "You took my cord?" she gasped, hand clutching her chest like I had snatched pearls right off her neck. I held it up. "You plugged it in again." She rolled her eyes. "I assumed you just needed time to think about it and realize you were overreacting." Overreacting. The sheer nerve of this woman nearly knocked me off my feet. "Karen," I said slowly, trying very hard not to let my voice rise, "I don't need time to think about it. I need you to stop stealing my electricity. It's not up for debate." She let out an exaggerated sigh. "Okay, fine. If it's that big of a deal to you, I'll find another solution." She snatched the cord from my hands and slammed the door. I should have felt relieved. But if there's one thing I had learned about Karen, it's that she never really accepted defeat. And sure enough, the next morning, she found a new way to escalate. Because that's when the HOA letters started. The first letter arrived in my mailbox a day later. Official looking, typed in the same passive-aggressive font HOA notices always seem to favor. Subject: compliance warning, violation of neighborhood standards. I read it twice, trying to process what I was looking at. Apparently, I was being formally advised about my lack of community spirit and my failure to support sustainable neighborhood efforts. It took me a solid minute to realize that this was Karen's revenge. I walked over to my next-door neighbor Tom's house, letter in hand, and knocked. He answered, coffee in one hand, an amused smirk already forming on his face. "Let me guess," he said before I could even speak. "Karen." I held up the letter. He burst out laughing. "She's really going all in, huh?" Tom, bless his nosy heart, was fully invested in the drama. He was also one of the unfortunate souls who had already been in Karen's crosshairs before. "She accused my cat of trespassing last month," he told me, shaking his head. "Filed a complaint and everything." "Your cat?" "Yeah. Apparently, Mr. Whiskers loiters on her porch menacingly." This was the moment I realized that the entire neighborhood had Karen horror stories. Word spread fast because, of course, it did. Within hours, I had people stopping by, sharing their own Karen encounters. Marge from across the street whispered, "She once told me my garden gnome disrupted the uniformity of the block." Dave, 2 houses down, muttered, "She reported my holiday wreath for being too large." Someone else claimed she once measured the angle of their driveway lights. But Karen had never gone this far before. Stealing electricity? Retaliating with fake HOA complaints? This was next-level insanity. To my surprise, I wasn't the only one fed up. "She's gone too far this time," Tom said, leaning in conspiratorially. "We should do something." "What? Start an underground resistance?" I joked. Tom grinned. "Actually, yeah. Because, as it turned out, I wasn't the only one who had been gathering evidence. Karen had made a lot of enemies. And now, the neighborhood was ready to fight back. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. I wasn't the type to escalate things, but after the HOA letter and her blatant disregard for personal property, I knew I couldn't just let this go. And apparently, neither could the rest of the neighborhood. The first step was gathering evidence. Tom had already been keeping a log of Karen's petty complaints, complete with timestamps and photos. Marge, who had an outdoor security camera pointed right at the street, pulled up footage of Karen sneaking over in the dead of night to plug her extension cord back in multiple times. But my personal favorite piece of evidence? Dave, the guy 2 houses down, caught her measuring his lawn with a ruler. Armed with all of this, I decided it was time for a little strategic revenge. I started small. The next time Karen tried to steal my power, I switched the outlet to a dummy socket, one that didn't actually provide any electricity. I watched from my window as she confidently plugged in her cord, completely unaware that she was powering absolutely nothing. The next morning, I saw her pacing around her greenhouse, shaking the extension cord like it had personally betrayed her. But that was just phase 1. Phase 2. The HOA meeting. Tom and I decided that if Karen wanted to weaponize the HOA, we'd beat her at her own game. We gathered every ridiculous complaint, every piece of video footage, and every neighbor who had ever been harassed by her. And we brought it all to the next HOA meeting. The moment Karen walked in, clipboard in hand, she immediately sensed the shift in the room. Usually, she strutted into these meetings like she owned the place, ready to recite her list of neighborhood offenders. But this time we were ready for her. And when I stood up, cleared my throat, and started my presentation, the look on her face was I stood up at the HOA meeting, cleared my throat, and did something Karen had never expected. I flipped the script. She had spent years terrorizing the neighborhood with her clipboard and her petty complaints. But tonight, the neighborhood had receipts. Before we begin, I said, pulling out a folder, I'd like to address an ongoing issue of rule breaking and property violations. Karen smirked, arms crossed, clearly thinking I was about to complain about someone else. That smirk did not last long. I held up a photo of her extension cord, plugged into my house. Murmurs rippled through the room. This, I continued, is Karen stealing my electricity. Repeatedly, after being told to stop. Karen's face turned a shade of red I had never seen before. That's ridiculous. It was. I held up my hand. Before you say anything, here's the video footage of you plugging it back in multiple times at night. Tom hit play on his phone. The video showed a grainy, night vision clip of Karen sneaking into my yard like a raccoon with a superiority complex, plugging in her extension cord like she was committing the perfect crime. The room erupted. Dave stood up next. While we're at it, I'd like to enter Exhibit B. He slapped down a printed-out photo of Karen measuring his grass with a ruler. Someone in the back stifled a laugh. Then Marge chimed in. And Exhibit C. Here's the complaint Karen filed about my garden gnome being disruptive to the aesthetic integrity of the neighborhood. The laughter wasn't being stifled anymore. Karen's jaw clenched. This is all being blown out of proportion. I folded my arms. You wrote me up for leaving my trash cans out 20 minutes too long. But stealing power? That's fine. At that moment, the HOA president, who, for the record, had been dealing with Karen's nonsense for years, finally spoke. Karen, she sighed, rubbing her temples, do you have anything to say in your defense? Karen, still flustered, let out a nervous laugh. I mean, it's just a little electricity. The HOA president stared. Silence. Then she reached under the table, pulled out a violation notice, and slid it toward Karen. Effective immediately, you are being fined for theft of utilities and violating property boundaries, she announced. Additionally, your ongoing pattern of harassment is grounds for removal from any future HOA decision-making roles. The room erupted again, but this time in cheers. Karen sat there, frozen, as if the reality of what had just happened was only now sinking in. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Karen was speechless. Karen stormed out of the HOA meeting that night, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. For someone who had spent years patrolling the neighborhood with a tape measure and a superiority complex, the public humiliation was too much to handle. The fallout was delicious. By the next morning, the entire cul-de-sac was buzzing. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded with posts. Someone had already turned Karen's sneaky nighttime power theft into a meme. Breaking news. The Queen of Rules caught breaking them. Tom, ever the instigator, took it a step further and started referring to Karen's greenhouse as the crime garden. But the real poetic justice? The HOA fine. Oh, Karen had loved fining people for the most ridiculous infractions. Lawn length, mailbox colors, porch decorations that offended her delicate sensibilities. But now she was the one receiving the dreaded HOA violation notice. And it wasn't just a slap on the wrist. She was fined for stealing electricity. She was fined for unauthorized property modifications. Apparently, her greenhouse wasn't even HOA approved in the first place. She was removed from any future HOA decision-making roles. For years, she had ruled the neighborhood like a tyrant. Now, she had been completely dethroned. And just when I thought it couldn't get any better, her greenhouse died. Without my free electricity, Karen refused to pay to run the heaters herself. Within a week, her precious organic vegetable project shriveled up like her reputation. Neighbors started openly ignoring her. Some even celebrated by intentionally breaking dumb HOA rules she used to enforce. One guy put up Christmas lights in April. Someone else parked their car slightly off-center in their driveway. Marge, she put out 3 garden gnomes. And the best part, Karen moved out. It took a few months, but eventually, the for sale sign went up in her yard. She never recovered from the embarrassment, and with no one left to boss around, she slinked away to some other unfortunate neighborhood. The day she left, we all stood on our driveways, watching as the moving truck pulled away. Tom, sipping his coffee, nudged me. "You know what this means, right?" "What?" He grinned. "We finally get to leave our trash cans out as long as we want." And just like that, peace returned to the neighborhood. What's the worst HOA or entitled neighbor story you've ever heard? If you caught someone stealing your electricity, how would you handle it? What's the pettiest HOA rule you've ever encountered? Do you think Karen got what she deserved, or would you have gone even further? What's the funniest way to get back at an annoying neighbor, without breaking any laws, of course? If you enjoyed this story of HOA chaos and sweet karma, don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow, and lets me know you want more crazy neighborhood drama. Backhand index pointing right, subscribe to HOA Havoc for more wild HOA stories, entitled neighbor showdowns, and satisfying revenge tales. And don't forget to hit that notification bell, so you never miss an update. Speech balloon, drop a comment below with your own HOA horror stories. I read every single one. Who knows? Your story might even be featured in a future video. Thanks for watching, and remember, lock your outdoor outlets.